Okay, let's go. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Gulf Intelligence Daily Energy Markets Live Video Podcast on Thursday, the 19th of May, with Brent oil crude at $110, still stuck in the band it's been in for nearly 3 months now. The big news yesterday, I guess, was in financial markets, where equities had their worst day since the bad old days of the pandemic in 2020. It's all about inflation, rising costs, and supply chain blockages. US consumer stocks were especially badly hit, people like Target. People just seem to be increasingly wary of spending money despite record employment levels in the USA. On war news, it's still a bloody battle of attrition, but there seems to be a growing feeling that Ukraine is slowly succeeding in its campaign to push Russia back from the initial gains in the east and south, though it's harder than ever, I think, to see an end game, and the possibility for serious escalation remains. On that subject, I want to go first to Professor Andrei Belyi, founder and CEO of Balasin, who is in Estonia. Hello, Andrei. You are a renowned Russia watcher. I want to get some sense of the state of the Russian economy, if you would. Sanctions were supposed to finish it off, but it doesn't look like that's happening. This week, we saw reported a record balance of payments surplus. The ruble is one of the best performing currencies of the year so far. So how is the Russian economy bearing up? Can it sustain the cost of war?
Well, Russian financial system remains resilient, practically thanks to the high oil price. Even when Russian oil companies are selling their oil with a discount of 30-40%, they're still making $60 or $70 per barrel. And they're pretty fine with that. However, sanctions don't have an immediate effect, never. Already now, we are seeing a dramatic impact on oil production that Russian government already foresees a decrease of oil output this year compared to 2021 by 17%, 17. And that's pretty much. And that's partly because sanctions restrict access to high technologies, including deep water drilling, including some of the liquefaction technologies, and including some exploration software. In addition to that, companies, international companies, are really leaving Russia, and are really leaving Russia without capacities to perform domestic industrial output, including, for example, machinery and automotive industries. They're going to decline for sure. And that's also affect Russia's oil revenues, because Russia's domestic market provides about 45% of revenues for domestic companies. So the situation is pretty tricky. I would say nobody should expect even that sanctions would affect Russian economy in the short term, but mid-term effects are already visible.
When does the ruble begin to show this effect, Andrei? As I said, so far it's been pretty strong this year, one of the strongest in the world, recovered from all the losses after the immediate aftermath of the invasion. When does the ruble begin to show that kind of effect?
It depends, because also Russian central bank has a pretty large reserve of gold that can also mitigate any collapse of ruble. And the overall financial situation is not that dramatic. What is actually dramatic, that sounds paradoxical, but that's how Russian economy has worked for the last 20 years. Financial system is relatively resilient, but the economy is suffering. Yes, you can create kind of cover for financial stability, but the unemployment gonna rise, the real costs of war for the economy gonna rise, and the industrial output gonna decline. After the end of this year, what we may see is a mismatch between Russia's GDP in terms of the oil price and in terms of purchase power parity.
Okay, let's move to Bora Barryman, who's managing partner for the Hormuz Straits Partnership. Bora, hello, welcome. Give me your take on the Russia-EU relationship, which I kind of characterize as a Mexican standoff. We saw a big EU strategy announced yesterday to wean to wean the EU off Russian oil, $220 billion worth over the next 5 years. Can that work?
I think it has to work from the perspective of the EU, given the strategy that they have locked themselves into. As I understand it, and I would defer to Andrei's expertise on this, you know, the EU is probably the most disadvantaged bloc globally out of this, standoff in Ukraine. Clearly, they are the most dependent on Russian energy sources. Clearly, just logistically, they are unable to get alternatives as economically as other regions of the world may be able to do. They had been paying for the Russian product in euros. Now, a significant portion of that, or maybe all of it, I'm not sure, is due in rubles, and the alternatives are priced in dollars at a time when the dollar is strengthening across all global currencies, and especially, again, the euro, which has had one of its sort of stool legs knocked out from under it. That leg being the ability to pay for Russian energy in euros. So they need to make an adjustment very quickly, given the current situation they're in.
We've seen some countries breaking ranks, haven't we? Hungary, yesterday, ENI of Italy agreed to pay in rubles, it seems. What does this tell us about EU solidarity and EU determination here?
Look, I don't want to be too critical. The fact of the matter is there is an economy of people, of citizens that need energy to work in all of these countries. And there might be sort of campaigners and interest groups that sort of prioritize other interests. But, even if we accept that there is this, in the words of some political figures, a war between the West and Russia, and I think that's an extreme characterization, but you could look at it that way. You would still need to secure energy resources to fight the war, right? So I just think that there's an engineering job to do here that's quite complex, and complex systems are prone to break down, right? Because the simple solution is just market trade flows, buying the cheapest source of energy from the closest location. But there's a political disagreement here that's violent, and the EU policymakers have to balance jobs, inflation, against their war aims, you could say.
Okay, well, talking about buying energy from the cheapest possible source, let's move to Victor Yang, who is in Guangzhou, China. Victor, hello.
Hello.
He's senior editor of JLC Network Technology. Victor, China is by all accounts continuing to import Russian oil at discounts. Give us your assessment of that situation, and will these purchases accelerate as EU sanctions tighten further as the year goes on?
Yes, well, and as you can see, April imports were rebounding modestly, and that was mostly because some state-owned companies bought more Russian cargoes on some kind of discounts. And as for independent refiners, they didn't do that because of the fear of the sanctions. Well, but this will probably continue as their cost pressure is so high. Saying just a few days ago, PetroChina said on its website that it began to source coal lake from Canada because of the cost efficiency as well. It was trying to look for alternatives because of the cost. So it's trying to, not just PetroChina, also Sinopec and other oil companies are trying to find some kind of alternatives when the costs are so sky high. So this will probably continue for some time, yes.
Tell me, what kind of discounts are Chinese buyers getting? Any
Well,
sense of that?
No, well, this is not reviewed yet as well, so we have no idea about this specific discount yet as well.
Okay, but you say it's the state organizations that are buying and the independent refiners are not. Is that right?
No, yes, right.
The other way around.
Yeah. Yes, well, no, you're right. And state-owned companies, some state-owned companies were hurt to buy more Russian crude, but independent as well. On the contrary, they cut the purchase of Russian crude as from, say, about April, late March. Well, and this one, this trend can continue for some time. Yes.
Okay, let's stay with you, Victor, for a while, because the very significant factor also this week, for this decade, of course, is the Chinese economy. We've seen slowing GDP growth, higher levels of indebtedness. Goldman Sachs cut Chinese GDP growth forecast to 4% from a previous, compared with the government's 5.5%. When will this have an impact on China oil demand?
Well, it's no surprise. It cut the forecast the GDP growth because of April data. And there has been concerns in China about the growth in the, later this year. So yesterday, the official government released some kind of announcement about its forecast of the GDP growth and economic growth, strengthening on the resilience, the market and its complete industry system and some of the advantages. Also there's been no lack of challenges during China's economic growth over the past few decades. And there have been even decades of forecasts of China's economy collapsing, Yes, but China also survived them. And as for the demand on energy, yes, surely there's kind of impact on energy demand. But on one hand, China is also trying to reduce its dependence on foreign energy. Say for crude, it's now it has been kind of stepping up its domestic production for about 2 years. And its April production grew by about 4%. That's the highest in recent years. The production is not large, China's production, but it's still the trend. And it has been cutting oil product exports, say gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel, even when domestic demand is weak. So it can reduce its dependence on foreign crude. And this is a very significant trend because, if you look at the data in the past few years, China's oil product exports has been surging for years until 2020. But in 2020, it declined for the first time in more than decades. And it has been dropping further in 2021. And this trend will continue in 2022. This is kind of good news for some traders in Asia because of much less supply from China. Yes.
Just briefly, if you would, what's the lockdown news from Guangzhou? Is there any sign of things being eased?
Earlier this week, I saw a commentary on the daily webinar saying that 44 cities in China were being locked down. I was kind of amused, because this data might be from, say, April. And as for now, Well, if you say 44 cities under lockdown, that would be kind of, well, amusing. Because, well, yesterday, China just reported 100 to 200 cases, well, and mostly in several cities, say like in Beijing, or about 50 cases. Well, but now it doesn't implement full lockdown, even Beijing. It just, well, require, I mean, several districts just require people to work from home, but they can still go out. Well, so it's not like in the past. So now Shanghai is only one exception. Shanghai is still under lockdown, but the restrictions now are now easing, and some people are coming out of their apartments now. And so China is now trying a new mode. Say is trying to test people more regularly, say about twice in 3 days in some big cities to prevent the lockdown like before, and to find out, well, the virus as soon as possible before it spread. So this is kind of a pilot project, say in big cities where the government plans to set up lots of testing locations. Well, say for people to within a walking distance of 15 minutes, wherever you are in the city. So you can test very conveniently, very easily, and try to avoid lockdown like before. So this might have some better effects. Yes.
Okay, so this sounds like some kind of easing of zero COVID policy then, perhaps.
Yes.
Let me go to Bora again, because you're in the UK, which has just reported the worst inflation levels for 40 years. Give me your sense of how it is there. We heard the governor of the Bank of England this week talk about apocalyptic price rises. How bad is it?
Well, 9% gets everybody's attention, and you can definitely feel it if you are an energy consumer. I think that's where it's hitting the hardest. And, the slogan of the day is the cost of living crisis. They talk about and they debate about this situation in the context of a cost of living crisis. And that's the way the debate is framed between the Bank of England, the cabinet, of course, the opposition, and even the supermarkets and the oil companies, of course, are caught in the crossfire on who is to blame. But from my perspective, the UK has been very much aligned with the sort of the North Atlantic financial framework, which has been imposed on the major economies, Europe, the UK, and the United States over the past few years. And we're dealing with the consequences of it. The latest sort of factor thrown into the mix is, of course, of the war. But from the perspective of, if you step back and you look at what has happened over the past few years, I've referred to a K-shaped economy where we were locked down, and then the central banks of the world tried to jumpstart with this quantitative easing and cheap money and the fiscal stimuluses. Certainly, Rishi Sunak should not take sort of a second rank to anyone in terms of the fiscal stimulus he put out. I think the fiscal stimulus of the UK in terms of the furlough scheme was quite generous, allowing people to basically weather the lockdown. And and now we're caught with this situation of record number of jobs and potentially not enough workers to fill those jobs. It's feeding into a labor side inflation factor. Then we have the supply side inflation factor. And what was sort of balancing the outlook and the feeling of the world during that K-shaped recovery was the wealth at the top, right? People were squeezed at the bottom, dependent on their stimulus checks, but at the top they had the great asset inflation due to QE. And now that's been wiped out. At least 15–16% of it has been wiped out since the beginning of the year. So now people at the top are beginning to wonder, where do we go from here? So to conclude, in response to your question, it is a difficult line to walk down for the central banks, the Bank of England, even our great leaders at the Fed in the US, because they want to orchestrate some type of soft landing for the economy, bringing down bringing down inflation without causing a recession.
Yeah, sure.
And it's a very difficult balance at this point.
Of course.
Given the very strong.
I guess for the UK, Bora, the other factor has to be Brexit as well, which you could say was a shooting in the foot, couldn't you? Can I move to Andre over in Estonia and get some sort of feel for the cost of living crisis there? Are you going through the same kind of crisis?
Yeah, all the Eurozone countries are experiencing a significant inflation. Obviously, energy bill inflation is very significant, but also the impact on daily life is actually felt, including the rise in food prices. And the crisis in food prices will or is likely to accelerate because of the continuing energy crisis. Before Bora elaborated about difficulties of the EU to cope with the diversification from Russian oil and gas, but there is another issue, is that Russia is somehow reducing its supplies of gas to the EU member states. There are already 2 member states which are out of the Russian gas, and there is a third one which is on the list, which is Finland. And don't forget that it's not entirely related to the payments in rubles, as many expect that actually if you pay in rubles, then things are going to be fine. Not necessarily, because Gazprom sanctioned German subsidiaries who are responsible in paying gas and in
its own subsidiaries,
former own subsidiaries.
Okay.
And that is actually shows that the hard game is still in place, and Europeans must also prepare themselves to possible supply shock from Russia that will first of all affect the fertilizer industry, because most of the power sector can be easily diverted. Well, not obviously all, but if you go back to the coal, in the coal power plants, you unfreeze them, it's still workable as a diversification plan. But fertilizers overwhelmingly depend on natural gas.
Okay. I want to just change the tone a bit here, if you don't mind, because towards the end of the year, the OPEC Plus agreement, as it currently stands, is up. And I think the people in Riyadh, Moscow, and elsewhere are thinking about what might replace it, and whether that structure will exist at all. And I would like to get a sense from the room here as to what the future of that agreement is. If we can pull up the question, please, you will have some idea of what I'm talking about. So the current OPEC Plus agreement finishes by the end of 22 at the latest, and possibly by September. Given the very different dynamic in global oil markets since the invasion of Ukraine, it is not worth continuing with the Saudi-Russia-led alliance, and either agree or disagree. So is it worth continuing with the OPEC Plus agreement? Agree or disagree? Let me go to Bora first and ask you your thoughts on that. What's the future of OPEC Plus?
My reaction to that is there's two perspectives that might be conflicting with each other: a political perspective and an economic perspective. So from the pure economic perspective, I'm not sure that OPEC Plus is critical for the self-interest of its members at this moment in time, right? Because there's a very tight market, and frankly, most of the OPEC members are struggling to meet their output ambitions. So there's not really an impetus to put in discipline to make people stick to their quotas, right? They're struggling just to attract the capital, to attract the technology from Russia's perspective, and also from Africa's perspective. Africa is a very important player in this energy equation. They're struggling to attract the investment to supply the market. But from the political perspective, I think Saudi Arabia might value that sort of power block with such an important player as Russia, and they might not want to give up that what is it called, that hotline between the two capitals, Riyadh and Moscow.
Okay, interesting view. Andrea, what do you think? Are there commercial benefits attached to OPEC Plus after the end of the current deal, or is it more a geopolitical relationship between Saudi Arabia and Russia, as Bora just suggested?
It's a little bit of both, and the oil markets are never purely economic or purely geopolitical. But having said that, much will also depend on how the Saudi Arabia will consider itself in the current standoff between Russia and the West. And many things will depend on the actual situation in Russia and in overall positions of strength between Russia and the West, and also between Russia and Ukraine. It's likely that Saudi Arabia will not always follow the alliance with Moscow if it gets other geopolitical considerations, possibly pressures or influences from the West, which are not insignificant in Riyadh, and also in case if there are political decisions to isolate Russia, then the question is where to get the alternative. Right. And I don't think that OPEC countries, the traditional OPEC countries, are very much against getting the share of the market instead of Russia. Particularly, the question is about Iraq, Libya, and Iran. All the three are having their own specific issues to increase the oil output, but the three countries can actually get bigger outputs and therefore can be favorable in having a new agreement with the OPEC.
Can they make up for Russia if Russia can those three countries compensate for a complete decline in Russian supply?
Theoretically, yes.
Okay. Russia has struggled, to meet its quotas, hasn't it? And if the current sanctions and embargoes carry on, then it will even more so. It simply will not be able to produce it. So it seems that the commercial aspect of OPEC Plus is dwindling in importance. Victor, let me go to you and get a view from China, if you would. What does China think of OPEC Plus? What do you think would happen to global oil markets if the current OPEC Plus arrangement ceased at the end of this year?
Well, as the question poll on the daily webinar, well, we do not expect to see a balance so soon yet. Well, and some OPEC members will have trouble meeting their quotas as well. And so we do not really expect to see a significant change yet, even at the end of the year. Yeah.
Okay. Can we pull up the result, please? Okay, so significant majority think that it is worth continuing with OPEC Plus. That's an interesting one to explore further, I think. But on that subject, I think we'll wrap it for today. Thank you all very much, Victor, Andre, Bora. Very interesting discussion. Thank you very much. It's the end of the week here in the Middle East, or approaching anyway. So we'll be back on Sunday, and I wish you all an enjoyable weekend. Thanks a lot, the three of you.
Thanks, Frank.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.